Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my talk. How we got rid of passwords in IoT, and what a question. Now, what I'm going to be doing this afternoon is I'm going to be talking about effectively our factory provisioning process. And this is really the second part of a 6-part series that we do in training at ARM on how to get your devices set up in a factory. So how do you get the credentials on the device? How do you get the settings on the device that you need to connect to the mothership, the Pelion service? Okay. So I originally asked if I could have 2 hours, and they said you can have 30 minutes. So this one, for those of you who have Audible subscriptions, and you have to listen to something on a little bit of a faster speed, it's going to be like one of those 1.5. It's going to be cranked up a little bit. But I believe everybody is going to be able to get the slides later. In a week and a bit, we've actually, if you're an ARM partner, we are doing a partner webinar, and we are going to be doing the initial talk that's going to cover a lot of the background on PKI, certification authorities, keys, and stuff like that. For those who are interested in that sort of background material, if you're not familiar with it, a lot of you I'm sure are, but if you're not, you know, if you're a partner, my email address is basically my name.mysurname@arm.com. So if you're interested in that, send me an email and I'll try to get you onto that webinar. It's in about 2 weeks. We'll be covering that. We'll be covering this talk in a little bit more detail, and I think the third one will be on how to do firmware updates in the field. Okay. So without too much further ado, let's get cracking. So here's the secret. This is how we get rid of passwords. Now, if you go and connect to a website, say you use your laptop, and you log into something, say it's an Amazon site and you want to pay, you log in. You sit there and you type a username and password, because you've set up an account with Amazon or whatever online store it is that you're visiting previously. The problem with IoT is we can't ship every microcontroller with a tiny little robot that is sentient, that sits inside the chip and types a username and a password for an account that's been set up previously. So what we do with Pelion is we use a very, very well-known, very established industry standard set of tools, and that is TLS. And this has been done for many, many years, and it's very robust, and it is fully understood. So what we do is mutual TLS authentication. We get the device to connect to the Pelion service, get the Pelion service to prove that it is indeed the Pelion service that it's connecting to, and it uses certificates to do that, does a TLS handshake. So that's the server part of the authentication. But then it turns around and it asks the device to authenticate itself as well. And that's the client part of the TLS authentication. And then the client will send certain information to Pelion, and that will enable it to authenticate this device. And the exact process of how this works is going to be the subject of today's talk. One more thing I have to tell you, a little bit of background information, is the mechanism that we recommend you do this in. You don't necessarily have to do it, but we use a protocol called lightweight M2M, MQTT coming at some point in the future. But for the time being, I'm going to refer to LWM2M a lot. You can connect directly to the lightweight M2M server, which is the device that sits in the Pelion mothership that accepts all the telemetry that you send from your devices. But it also exposes an interface to a thing called a bootstrap interface. So we set up a special bootstrap server, and the flow that we recommend you use is you do not just connect to the lightweight M2M server after your device comes out of the factory. You connect first to the bootstrap server. The bootstrap server will then give you the credentials for your device that you need, and your device will then be able to use those credentials to connect to the lightweight M2M server. Okay, so that's more or less the flow. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Now, for the next 23 minutes, we're going to be talking about that single slide up there and how that is constructed. Okay, so I'm not going to show you any other slides. I'm going to take you through that bit by bit. I'm going to show you how it is all built up, where the certificates come from, where the certificates go to, which ones need to go into the device, and I'm going to talk about it in 6 specific steps. So before I get started with the steps, I just want to give you an idea of what we're looking at over here. So on the right-hand side, you can see there is the Pelion device management area. That's something that is running inside the cloud. It's part of Pelion. So the Bootstrap server, the lightweight M2M server, as well as all those CAs running over there are stuff that is run and controlled by ARM. Those are things that we've set up. But in this presentation, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background to show you how we set those things up. That'll help you to understand it better. If you were to go out and provision devices yourself, it helps to understand exactly where all the certificates come from. Then in the middle, there is a box there for a thing called the FCU. That stands for Factory Configurator Utility. It's something that we provide to our customers. You can download it from the portal. I'll show you where. And that is something that's going to be in the factory or whatever trusted facility that you have where you go and inject credentials into your devices. At the bottom in the middle, there is a firmware authority machine or a CA. And that is something that's going to be run at your office, wherever your developers are, your firmware developers. So firmware developer will be writing a new version of the firmware, something that needs to go on the device. And the device then needs to be able to figure out somehow whether this is a legitimate update or if this is somebody trying to hack into it. And the way that this happens and the way that we prove it is we have a CA, and the certificate from that CA goes onto the device during factory provisioning. So then when a firmware update gets sent, you send a thing called a manifest to the device, and the manifest is signed by that firmware authority, certification authority. So your device will then be able to determine whether this is legitimate or non-legitimate firmware that's being sent to it over the air. Okay. And last but not least, on the left-hand side, that's the device and all the certificates that go onto it. So here's our workflow, 6 steps. I'm going to talk to you through them one by one. Now, every time I'm going to go to a step, there's going to be a list of stuff explaining exactly what I'm about to tell you. I'm not going to read the slides off. That's for your own reference later when you look at the slides, so it's easy to remember what I said and what is going on the next slide. So this is something that ARM did. This is not something that you have to do. But the first thing is we have to commission the Device Management Bootstrap Certification Authority. And the way that you do that, you generate a key pair, you generate a certificate, you sign the certificate, and then you issue it to yourself because it's a root CA. Okay. I'm going to start running through these a little bit quicker. We do the same for our lightweight M2M CA. Generate, issue, sign, issue to self. And then there is another certification authority that we have that's not a root CA, it's an intermediate CA, and that's something that lives online in Pelion all the time. And this is the certification authority that we use to issue the device lightweight M2M certificates that the device gets once it goes out in the field that it will use to connect to Pelion. So that's a CA that will be issuing that, but this will become a little bit clearer in a minute when we go through the steps. Okay, so generate the key pair, send a certificate signing request to the CA, the lightweight M2M CA, generate certificate, sign certificate, and then issue it. Now, these are color-coded to make it a little bit easier to follow. So you'll see for any given server or any given machine or device, they're all different colors. So when a certificate is belonging to a particular device or a particular server, it will be the same color as the server. And if something is signed by something, like there are several CAs in this diagram, whatever color that CA is also the color of the pen that's signing the certificate. So it just makes it a little bit easier to follow what has been issued to what and by whom. Okay, so the lightweight M2M device sub CA now has its CA certificate as well. Then we're going to export the Bootstrap CA and lightweight M2M CA root certificates. Okay, so that's all been done. It's the established trust over there. And later you will need those certificates, and I'll show you where to get them to put on your device to be able to make your device trust both the Bootstrap server and the lightweight M2M server. The Bootstrap server had to be issued with a certificate. This is just a normal server certificate, and that is coming from the Bootstrap CA. So it's issuing that. So now the Bootstrap server has its own server certificate. It's just like a web server certificate, typically. And we do the same with the lightweight M2M server. So key pair generated and certificate issued. Okay, so this has all been done. This is all managed by ARM. This is not something that you need to worry about, but now at least you know where those things originate from. Here's the bit where you come in as a customer. You have to set up your factory line. The first thing is you need to create yourself a Pelion account. And if you create a Pelion account, you're going to get a thing called a Pelion account ID. And that's something you're going to need when you do factory provisioning, because when your device connects, you might want, there are different workflows, but in many of them you want the Pelion service to know what account it is that is connecting to the Pelion service. Or, you know, this device belongs to the account of this corporation or this entity. Okay. So, the first thing that you then have to do is you have to get those root CA certificates onto your factory configurator utility. How do you do that? Well, you log into the Pelion device management portal, and there is a setting or an area in the Pelion device management portal called factory or factory provisioning. And then you'll see there's a factory configurator utility that we provide. You can download it, just a little button, click on it. You get a zip file, you extract it, and then you'll see there's a resources directory. Inside of the resources directory, you'll see there are 2 certificates, and you're going to need those. And that one is called the Bootstrap Server CA, as well as the LW M2M Server CA. Those are the root certificates, and you're going to need those to make your device trust both the lightweight M2M server as well as the Bootstrap server, respectively. Okay. Now, once you've got your factory configurator utility, you have to commission your factory configurator utility machine. And there's a setup command that you run, and that turns this into a CA. Full instructions provided. So you run it. It will then generate this, generate a certificate, sign the certificate, and then you'll have a certificate on this machine. Now, the reason you need this is because your factory configurator utility is going to issue individual certificates to every single device that you provision in the factory. So there's not going to be anything like 2 different devices with the same certificate. So when the device goes into when you plug it into the factory tool or the factory machine, whatever device you use to do this, it can go over serial or Ethernet, the device is going to send a certificate signing request to the factory configurator utility after it's generated the key pair, and then the factory configurator utility is going to generate a certificate for that device that's unique for that device, and then it's going to move on to the next one. And every single certificate is going to be unique. Now, in order for the cloud service, the Pelion cloud service, to trust that device, it needs to be able to trust the certification authority that issued the certificate to that device. And for that, what we need to do is we need to export the FCU CA root certificate to Pelion. So we're going to export this out of band, and we're going to upload it to Pelion, and it's going to sit there, metaphorically speaking, in the Bootstrap server. And the way you do that is you log into Pelion, you go to device identity certificates, and you upload that certificate. So it's not the private keys, it's just a certificate, and that is used to establish trust, because it's the root CA certificate. Okay. Now, the next step, we're going to commission a firmware authority CA. Now, strictly speaking, you do not need to actually do this at the time that you go to the factory. You might already have a CA that you want to use for this, okay? But just in case you don't, before you provision your devices for the factory, you're going to want to have a firmware authority root CA certificate. And that will go into the device in the factory in order for you to be able to perform secure firmware updates after that thing leaves the factory. Okay. So we provide a utility on GitHub. It's called the manifest tool, and it's something that you use to create firmware manifests. We have another presentation on that in our partner webinar. If you're interested, we go through the entire process. But what you do is you download the manifest tool from GitHub, and you install our little tool on your firmware authority machine. You generate a CA certificate, basically turns that into a CA. So you got your public-private key, generate the certificate, sign it. And then what you want to do is to export this to your firmware authority CA certificate. Now, that's done out of band. That looks a bit like an oil drum or a database. It's from PowerPoint. It's really a hard drive. You just need to find some way to get that certificate onto the factory configurator utility. Okay. Now we're in the manufacturing process. Okay. So the idea of what we want to do now is we want to give the device the credentials that it will require to connect to the Bootstrap service in Pelion. So it doesn't need to connect to the lightweight M2M service at all. We only want it to be able to connect to the Bootstrap service. There is an optional way that you can make it connect to the lightweight M2M, but we don't recommend it. So I'm going to talk about how to connect it to the Bootstrap service. Okay. Another thing that I should be saying at this point is what it's going to show now is you're going to inject certificates and stuff step by step into the device. This is just one of those things where you go into bullet time and show we do this thing, then we do this thing, we do this thing. What we're actually doing is we're injecting one big blob at the same time. So I separated them out a bit just to make it a little bit clearer of what is actually happening when we do this. Okay. So in no particular order, firmware authority certificate gets injected from the FCU into the device. We then inject the Bootstrap CA and lightweight M2M CA root certificates into the device as well. So that will then enable the device to trust those 3 different CAs respectively. So the Bootstrap CA, anything that it issued a certificate to will be trusted by the device. Same for lightweight M2M certificate. And the firmware authority CA will then enable the device to trust anything that gets signed by the firmware authority CA. And that will be signing your firmware update manifest later when you do firmware over-the-air updates. Okay. So now the device knows how to trust it. Notice that none of those certificates that are on the device at this stage are actually belonging to the device. Okay. Those are all root CA certificates. Now, generate and inject device Bootstrap certificate and keys. Now, there are 2 ways you can do this. The best way to do it is to go out and spend enough money on proper hardware for your device so your device is capable of generating public-private key pairs. In which case, your device will be able to go and generate a public-private key pair, generate a certificate signing request, and send a certificate signing request to the factory configurator utility. That is not what I'm showing in this slide because the default setting, and this, by the way, is just one setting you change in the text file, assumes that somebody is just using the defaults. And for the defaults, there are some people who use hardware that are not capable of generating key pairs. So we've built the ability to do this into the factory configurator utility. So in this case, the factory configurator utility is going to generate the key pair and is going to issue the certificates. Okay, so generate the public-private key pair, generate certificate signing request, generate the certificate, sign it, and then issue it. And once you've issued it, obviously you can inject it. Now, here is a very, very important little piece of information I want you to pay attention to. For those of you who know how these X509 certificates work, there is a field in the certificate called the subject. And the subject is what identifies the entity that the certificate is bound to. In this case, the device. So that is effectively the username of this device that this device is going to use to log in to the Pelion service. Okay? So the endpoint name, and we have a description of what the convention is that we want you to use when you name them. You only have to ensure that the endpoint name is unique within your account. Okay? It doesn't have to be globally unique, but do not have more than one endpoint name that's the same for your Pelion account. Okay? So that's going to go into the subject field of the device Bootstrap certificate. Okay. And then if you have to inject the private key into the device from the FCU, you can do it as well. Of course, this wouldn't happen if the device is capable of generating it in the first place. Okay. Now we get to the interesting part. The device is now finished provisioning, and it's left the factory. One other thing I would like to just add is, apart from all the certificates that I've shown you and the keys that get injected, there are some other bits of information that also get injected by the factory configurator utility when you provision the device. For example, what is your Pelion account ID? Okay. Other things would be specific information about the device and so on and so forth. So it is not only the certificates that get injected into the device. There are some configuration details. What's the URL of the Bootstrap server, for example? You know, where do you need to go to connect to find the Bootstrap server? That information gets injected as well. So the device has now left the factory. it's gone into the field, and it gets powered on. What happens? Okay. Mutual TLS authentication. So that's the first step. So what will happen is the device will look at the URL of the Bootstrap server that it's supposed to connect to get to Pelion, and then it will go and do server authentication. It will ask the Bootstrap server to prove its identity, and it will validate that that is actually the Bootstrap server that it trusts because it's got the Bootstrap CA root certificate. And it performs a number of very well understood, well documented steps on the server side of TLS mutual authentication to validate the provenance of the server that it's connecting to. Once that succeeds, it then goes and performs a client authentication step. So the server then asks the device to authenticate itself as well. And one of the things that happen during that step is that the client has to send its certificate to the server. And if you remember, in the certificate, the subject identifier or the subject entry for that certificate is the endpoint name that you've given that, and that's effectively your username for that device. So by extracting the subject information from the certificate, the Bootstrap server now knows what the external endpoint name is. Okay. The next thing that happens is that the device will send the account ID of your Pelion account to the Bootstrap server, and now your Bootstrap server knows that as well. So the name that you've given your device and the account that belongs to you, and that is what the server needs to do the next step, which is to go and generate an internal, globally unique device ID. So there's a device directory in Pelion. The Bootstrap server sends that information over to the server, and it will then go and generate this. So the device directory generates a globally unique device identifier, just called the device ID, and that gets sent back to the Bootstrap server. Now, depending once again on what settings you've enabled in the factory and on the capabilities of your hardware, your device can now go and say, okay, I want to generate my own public-private key pair, which is the best way to do it, because then the private key never leaves the device. But if you leave it on defaults, what we do is we can generate that for you, or if you have a device that's not capable of generating keys, you'd be able to still use Pelion. The slides is going to show it in the second option. So what happens is on the Bootstrap server, we generate the key pair for you, generate certificate signing request. The certificate signing request here is the interesting part, because when you generate the certificate signing request to get the certificate that will enable the device to connect to the lightweight M2M server, the distinguished name is made up of those three things. So the external endpoint name, the account ID, and the device ID that was generated inside of Pelion, which is globally unique. And that is all now the new subject name for the new certificate. And that certificate gets generated and issued by the lightweight M2M device sub CA that sits inside of Pelion, which is owned and operated by ARM, so you don't have to. Okay. So you generate and issue those. Certificate gets generated, it gets signed, it gets issued, and that then gets injected into the device. So over a TLS connection, and if you haven't generated the keys yourself, you can then inject them over TLS into the device. Which brings us to the last step, which is the registration and in-field regular use. So what happens now is you'll notice that your device has two certificates that's issued to it, which is the device Bootstrap and the device lightweight M2M certificate. And the device lightweight M2M certificate is what it's going to use to authenticate itself back to the lightweight M2M server. So the first step is now going to connect to the lightweight M2M server and ask it to do server authentication. So lightweight M2M server, prove your identity. Lightweight M2M server does that, that succeeds. And then the next step is the lightweight M2M server turns around and says, okay, now prove who you are. It uses the client certificate that was issued to it in the previous step, and then it can perform mutual TLS authentication. Once that's happened, it can register with the lightweight M2M server, and then you can proceed to do regular things with it, like send telemetry back to Pelion. So that is basically the talk. I hope you found it interesting. If you're interested in any further information on how we do provisioning, just bear in mind this is a small little part of a much larger volume of material that we have available at ARM to explain how to use the Pelion service. If you're interested in signing up for the webinar, please do drop me an email and we'll see what we can do. And we also have workshops where we run through this in about 4 hours, where you go from zero, where you have a board with absolute nothing on it, and then we'll take you step by step through getting it factory provisioned and ready for production. Okay. Thank you very much.